Hello, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching Tech Now. Tonight we are joined by technology commentator Sarah Putt, and we will be discussing some of the week's big tech issues that include the new Labour-led government has appointed David Clarke as New Zealand's tech minister. Sarah will take us through how the tech sector has responded to this controversial but vitally important appointment. Also, Trump is out and Joe Biden is on his way in. So how tech-friendly will the United States President-elect Joe Biden be? And also our third issue to this tonight. We've heard all about the Internet of Things, but what's this Internet of Behaviours? Sarah is going to take us through all of the angles of that. But before we do, let's just give this invitation to you, of those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, feel free to make comments, and if you do, we'll be able to include your interaction in our program. So let's cross to Sarah, who is waiting for us to get into these issues online right now. Good evening, Sarah.
Kia ora, Selwyn. How are you?
Very good. Kia ora to you too. So we've obviously, we've had elections in New Zealand as well as in the United States. It's obviously a little bit after ours. But the appointments of our new Labour-led government have been made. There has been some surprises and there has been some certainties. One of the surprises was perhaps David Clarke being appointed into the tech sector as the minister for what you talk us through it, Sarah. What is his official title?
Well, in these other shows that we've done, previously we've had a wee bit of a chat about the fact there isn't a minister for tech, but effectively that's kind of what David Clarke is, or should I say Dr. David Clarke, because that's his full title. He has come in at number 19 in the cabinet, and most of us will know him as the health minister that made an unfortunate trip or two during the lockdown and had to leave cabinet because of it. But he returned into Parliament with an increased majority. He has Dunedin North as his seat, and he's been rewarded for taking his medicine, if you like, and standing back during the COVID, during all the COVID lockdowns. And he has now been appointed, and I give you the portfolios: Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Digital Economy and Communications, State-Owned Enterprises, and Statistics. He's also got earthquake recovery, but I don't include that in the tech sphere.
Right. Yeah.
All the others, though,
they're fairly. Some people have been playing down the power of those portfolios, but they're pretty hefty. And I think too that we're into a situation, particularly in the New Zealand cabinet, where it's almost like there's a lot of overlap with various ministers. So I kind of see David Clarke's, let's say, tech minister role for ease of, get away from the jargon a little bit. I see that as being very much interconnecting with many other ministers. For example, economic development that Stuart Nash has got. They're obviously moving Stuart into those areas of economics, etc., etc. You've also got anything around David Clarke intersecting perhaps with overseas tech giants, global conglomerates in the digital space, is going to require an all-of-government kind of approach, if you like. So some of the commentary around that, I think it's been a little bit old hat in the sense that it just looks at one person. So that said, let's have a look at some of the reactions that have taken place, because then you'll be, no doubt, Sarah, be speaking to those. Now, the ODT, obviously this is where David Clarke comes from. Went on his appointment, front page, better match, David Clarke back in cabinet is the headline. And it goes through there and it just highlights there, obviously, his portfolios, but also the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's kind of position here. And on this occasion, my viewers, she says, is that we have given a better match to his skill set in areas where he has enormous value to add, particularly in the space around growing the digital economy and digitising the public space. Now, those are two key planks that she is calling, that she believes New Zealand needs to actually address and underscore, and one would expect that there'll be concerted efforts in the first, say, 12 months, 18 months to actually get some progress on those two things. So digital economy, digitising the public space. So Sarah, the reactions in the tech world, from my observations, and albeit from a bit of a distance quite often, is one where there was disappointment, would be one side of it. For example, Business Desk, Peter Griffin, a well-respected writer, journalist, commentator in such space as this, published in Business Desk quite a critique, really, of David Clarke, and where Peter Griffin is acknowledging that he's trying to be positive. You've also got Newsroom, that perhaps was even more scathing. If we go down to the last paragraph of this, and the writer, I should say, is James Elliott's Political Week. And he's talking about Washington and all sorts there, but he's talking about David Clarke in this paragraph, and he says, so if you've recently set up a new business in an earthquake-prone area, providing digital statistical support services to the government, SOE clients, don't expect too much help from the relevant government ministries. You might be better off heading out for a cycle or going to the beach or cycling to the beach. And he's obviously having a dig at what you alluded to earlier on, that some of the misdemeanours of David Clarke when he was health minister, in particular during New Zealand's COVID lockdown. So he's obviously not impressed over there. But Sarah, take us through, because you've written about this yourself in Computer World.
I have, yes. And I think, a couple of things there. First of all, I acknowledge what you're talking about in terms of, it seems very much now that there's a fully Labour cabinet, if you like, or ministers inside there, is that they've tranches. So there's a health response and there's an economic response. And I think you're right. This ministry, this collection of portfolios very much sits in the economic tranche with Stuart Nash's economic and small business, even Damien Connors, who's got trade and export growth, and people like Megan Woods, who's got science and innovation still, along with her other clutch of portfolios. So yes, absolutely. So that's an acknowledgement that tech is essential, as part of the economic recovery. What you're also seeing is, I think, where you said, I think Peter Griffin's, the headline to Peter's story absolutely sums it up, trying to be positive. One of the things that we've seen, the most sort of the public side of the tech portfolio is the comms side, which is the UFB. It's the big, expensive telco rollouts, which are actually almost finished. The actual build side of them, the fibre networks, is pretty much done. And in the past, we've seen, Stephen Joyce came in with the portfolio at number 20 in the first John Key government. No one knew who he was, but goodness, what a difference he's made.
Some of us had a bit of an inkling, didn't we?
Yes. And, the second one was Amy Adams got it and then of course Chris Farfoy had it last time. And Claire Curran. But what you saw with those first three that I mentioned is that it was very much they were on the way up. They wanted to succeed in that portfolio so that they could get up the ranks and get the heftier roles. And I think there's a sense in tech that he's on the other way. So I think what we're trying to do is say, hopefully he will see these portfolios as a way to rehabilitate his career, because there's a lot to get your teeth into. As you point out, low profile, but high impact. There's all sorts of things coming down the line. I mean, there's things that, people like yourself and I get quite interested in, like consumer data rights, sovereignty, data sovereignty, all those kinds of issues, which are quite pointy-headed and often missed in the mainstream, but which can bounce back and have big effect on people's lives. Yeah. But whether or not, and obviously there's also how do you regulate big tech from New Zealand, and whether or not, though, because we got in there as a country, as a nation, with the Christchurch call in the absolute worst way. But certainly the Christchurch massacres has meant that New Zealand now has almost an input to give, a unique angle and perspective to give onto that. And I'm sad that we have, for that reason, but I feel that we can't take away from the fact that we are able to put forward a very legitimate point of view, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll just speak to the politics around David Clarke in brief here. I'll try to be brief. As with David Clarke, for many, up until the COVID lockdowns and those misdemeanours of which he has become infamous, perhaps, he was actually seen as a reasonable and in many courts a good Minister of Health, and obviously it's a robust, important portfolio. There was a lot of turning around, a lot of infrastructure build of which was under his watch, that was, fixing a lot of the neglect that had occurred probably in the wake of the global financial crisis, if I was going to be totally bipartisan on that. So with David Clarke, I don't see necessarily that his trajectory is going down and this appointment is the zenith of his career. It's really up to him. He's obviously got skills. I think Jacinda Ardern has called it right, that the skill sets of which are going to be required to dip in where he's going to have to engage on this particular tech sector are intersecting the digital economy in a big way. And remember, that's one of the things she's framing there. And I think he's well qualified, well positioned to interact. The other thing that stands out to me is the other ministers that are above him seem reasonably satisfied that they have got a guy that can specialise in the tech space, perhaps, that takes a bit of the weight off them. If it was tagged on, for example, to Megan Woods or tagged on to the economic development with Stuart Nash, it would be lost in the power of the requirements of those other portfolios. It certainly would be. So this, I think, is a skillful appointment in a sense to a person who, let's face it, he's got to prove his worth. And one would imagine he'll be working very hard. And he's obviously got the confidence of those heavy hitters in the top five, which includes, don't forget, David Parker in those areas with portfolios that he's got with respect to revenue. So that's really, really an interesting appointment. And I wouldn't actually get on the populist bandwagon. I'm not inside the tech fraternity, but I do feel it. My whole livelihood is based on digital tech and services of which export. So I feel okay about this. Sorry, I was just going to lead in with a question, but you're going to pick up and leverage off that. Yeah.
Oh, no, well, I was going to say, well, that's good news, because you see what he has to do is it's just that tech don't know him. Never had much connection with him. He never led in data around health and, say, a Bill English did, in terms of he wanted to use data to transform healthcare. He never really engaged from that way. Yeah. So I think he's got a job now to go out there before Christmas and get himself on the map. And he may be doing that right now. I've certainly put a call in. I'm waiting for my interview. And,
you're waiting for your interview? He's put out on what's he got here? When he was appointed, I've got the Facebook entry that he did, and he says, a big day, he's chuffed. He's thanking the Prime Minister and also the caucus, and that's significant because remember, in the Labour Party, the caucus actually places those MPs up into the ministerial roles, or having a go at that. So look, it's an interesting thing. I think the digital economy is the fascinating element. Remember that some of the digital services of which the country is going to be even more reliant on from a point of view of exporting those services. It's going to be a happening thing. If it doesn't come in 12 months, well, it will be a sudden, short, sharp shock, I would imagine, with a reshuffle at the end of 2021. So let's... The
first 100 days should be sent meeting everybody in tech. So I'll let you know.
Here's our transition. The Trump is going, even if he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth, as the old saying goes. There's smiles all around the world. It's quite amazing, isn't it? All the social, political etiquette that goes with, observing the respect of the office, and et cetera, the position of the office. is rendered obsolete when you see the delight on the people's faces. You even saw Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, for example, making reference in the same speech to the Holocaust and then to the unification, and then leading toward, brighter days with Joe Biden at the helm and the special relationship that Germany has with the United States. And I thought that was a little bit of a dig at the English as well. Boris Johnson obviously is on the outer with respect to that special relationship that they've enjoyed over the years. Anyway, Sarah, let's get down to it. Social media giants like Facebook, Twitter probably no longer have to worry too much about the presidential tweets. That's what you sent to me before the program.
I did.
What's that about? You think Joe Biden's soft and they're going to talk over his head, or what's...
Well, no, I just don't think he's going to be, firing out crazy tweets at 3:00 in the morning, insulting other national leaders and people in his own court staff.
It'd be an extreme surprise if he did.
Coming up with strange theories about this person and the other person and defaming goodness knows who's and all the stuff, and that had led Facebook and Twitter to go to that unusual circumstance. And Twitter started it by actually putting cautionary notices on the tweets that he sent, and then causing another furore around the fact that was that political bias. Now we're even seeing, that was just a massive headache for Google and Facebook and Twitter and anybody where he had his social presence. And now, of course, we're seeing the media themselves just starting to turn it off when his press conferences or people who are supporting him have their press conferences and just go beyond that pale. So Biden is, but that doesn't mean they're going to get an easy ride, because I don't think Biden's going to tweet like that. I don't think he's going to run the country via Twitter. But I think what he will do is he will look towards some more of that regulation. And for those of us who are a bit pointy-headed, Section 230 of the...
That is very pointy-headed.
Now, what that means is that social networks in America are protected from libelous people posting libelous information. So if a publisher, you or I, in a magazine or wherever, wrote a defamatory comment, we would be head up. But they, to a certain extent, are excused from all of that. So if people put all that rubbish up on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, they're almost excused from that under Section 23. They get sort of almost a free pass. They're immune from prosecution. Now, this is where it gets the heart of the whole idea around social platforms. Are they publishers in the sense that the New Zealand Herald is a publisher, Evening Report is a publisher, or are they protected? Are they social networks? Are they a platform for all that? And that sets them apart, and therefore they don't have to follow by the same rules. And this is going to really be debated, because the Republicans want to see Section of 230 either repealed or changed or altered.
Okay.
He does too.
So let's pick that up then. As it stands, Congress is not all in the hands of the Democrats at this stage. It may be, but it looks most likely that the Senate will be controlled by the Republicans.
Yeah.
The House will remain tighter than it was last term, but still in the hands of the Democrats. So one would get a sense that what you're talking about there, the Republicans will have their time in the sun.
I think what will happen is that both parties, Democrats and Republicans, want to put some curbs on big tech.
And this will be their common ground moment, do you think?
Yeah, and they're both coming at it from a different perspective. So an easier way, it's very simplified, because it's not just Section 230, it's also looking at trust and trying to conquer the idea that these big companies are monopolies and they have too much commercial power. And so the Democrats think that they've got too much power, and some of them, in an ideal world, in a kind of quite radical way, part of the Democratic Party think that they want to break them up for that reason. Republicans come from a different perspective, and they're much more about the fact that they don't like the idea that they have control over speech and political. They're always accusing Facebook and Twitter and all that lot of political bias. So they worry about the messages, and Democrats worry about the competition and whether or not, because they're so powerful, they're actually affecting new businesses, and they're actually
so in our previous episodes, we have very strongly put into scope the elements of breaking up the giants. That putting a competitive element back into the tech environment, if you look at it from a commercial sense. So in some ways, what you're saying there is that major push that has been shaping up in the courts in the last few years and is perhaps intensifying by degrees, in the last 6 months, it's in the court of the Democrats as well.
Absolutely. I'm just saying they're coming at from different angles.
Different angles. But the one from the point of view of free speech and all of that type of thing, that you're saying the Republicans are more kind of concerned with, that's a harder beast to tame, isn't it?
It is and it isn't, because it's, almost that's in it's the most obvious place that you would attack the big social media giants and the big tech giants, because don't forget, you've got Google through Facebook, you've got Google through YouTube, you've got Facebook, you've got a whole raft of them. Whereas the harder one to prove is the antitrust and anti-competitive, because as I keep saying to people who, whenever this comes up, the biggest problem with these big tech companies is that they create that consumers love them. It's not a problem, right? They create beautiful, frictionless, easy solutions that all of us use every day, and there's a reason, because they're good at what they do.
There's the social dilemma.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
And look, we are going to dedicate a whole episode to the social dilemma, aren't we, Sarah? We're going to be looking at the main takeaway points from that Netflix documentary, of which has raised concerns all over the world. I won't labour the point too much now, but one can expect in the next 2 weeks we will go full on for the whole episode in talking about the pros, the cons, the whole thing. And I think the word dilemma was a fabulous kind of way of framing that whole issue, of which was pitched in that documentary. Let's take a transition, and we'll come back about this Internet of Behaviours. We've all heard about the Internet of Things. What on earth have you identified here, this Internet of Behaviours? It sounds pretty scary. Anyway, we'll go to one of these wonderful transitions. We'll be back in a few seconds. How did you like the time lapse, going behind the Pahutakawa tree in the backyard here?
I love these.
It was wonderful. Yeah.
A little harbinger towards Christmas.
Yes.
With the Pahutakawa tree, nice little knot, without being too, obvious about it, too shocking.
Not too much, the New Zealand Christmas tree, the Pahutakawa, wonderful thing. Anyway, Sarah, let's get back on message here. Internet of Behaviours. Walk us through this, will you?
Okay, so you mentioned the Internet of Things before. The Internet of Things is this idea that you put sensors everywhere so that you can collect loads and loads of data, and you can see what's going on. So a really easy, simple example is you put lots of sensors around milk vats or whatever, and then you can find out, what's happening and when they're and how they're behaving and how it all works and all the rest of it. So Internet of Things is massive. It's Alexa is an example of Internet of Things. It's all over the place. So actually, Alexa is probably more of an example of AI. But my point being that lots of sensors out there sending back data so people understand what's going on. One of the things that people are now talking about is this thing called Internet of Behaviours. And basically, it's this idea that you collect all this data, what Gartner, which is a big analyst, calls people's digital dust, and you combine it all together. And not only do you...
Hopefully it's not digital ashes.
That's a whole other topic. But what you do is you create all this data that people do, and it can be from anything from facial recognition to location data.
And we've got that facial recognition. The New Zealand Police is right firmly smack and scope of that, isn't it? At the moment, lots of debate about that.
They started looking into it, and I think it was someone who was quite sort of low down in terms of command, and they got a little bit into trouble, and now they've kind of come down on it. But it was only because of some very good reporting from people like Phil Pennington at Radio New Zealand that really did surface.
Yeah.
And facial recognition is a really interesting one, because the tech companies themselves are saying, look, do we need to actually have a public discussion about facial recognition? It is such an intrusive technology. Of course, to your point, it's probably already out there in the wild. But the idea is that we collect all this data, and you can use it to change consumers' behaviour, but you can also use it to change citizens' behaviour. So one of the examples
this is relating to government, isn't it? And large bodies. So if they picked up some of the stuff that Facebook and Google have been kind of masterminding.
Well, the example that they give is that they say maybe you want to monitor compliance with health protocols during a pandemic. Reasonable enough thing to want to do. Now, the way that you might leverage Internet of Behaviours is using computer vision to see whether employees are wearing masks or thermal imaging to identify those with a fever. So you're using all this data points that people don't even really kind of compute, that you're actually taking that data for another reason.
Okay, so there's two elements of preventative measure there. One person's not wearing the mask. Next thing, it flashes up on screen, or a drone comes along into their workspace and says, put on your mask. And the other thing is relating to temperature control. Obviously, it's one of the symptoms, isn't it? Temperature sensing is one of the symptoms of many viruses. But so, is that fair enough, do you think, in these pandemic times?
I think it's a very interesting development, is the idea that it's not just direct, and that the idea that I gave you was quite a direct, use of technology, because we're using loads of technologies here, and you can imagine it being applied in all sorts of ways. Not just those big social media, so they can flog you more products or whatever or get you to vote in a certain way. Beyond that, it's actively changing people's behaviour by watching what they do and putting it all together, and then changing and trying to attempt to change the way they go about what they're going to do. And this is open to governments doing it, big commerce doing it, and as they pointed out that by the end of 2025, so that's only 5 years away, it's estimated that half the population of the world will be in some kind of Internet of Behaviours type.
Okay, can you bring it into realism for us? How are we going to see this manifesto being rolled out? How is it going to impact on us? We get the ideals of privacy invasion, of data theft, of our data identities being stolen and flogged off in commercial sense. How is it going to be a problem? I'll get back to the first part of the question. What will we see the government do of which becomes real in this space, and what should people be doing about it?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily our government is going to do, or any government's going to do it. It's the potential is there, because you can collect so much data from people, and in something.
But you've identified it as an issue. So,
I think so.
So there must be a real tangible kind of shape and momentum to this being rolled out in some way. So if it is being rolled out in some way, beyond just a caution, what would that look like?
Well, it would look like something like, so basically you would almost, the way I see it is things like what's happening in China right now. When we see things like, we see people who are caught jaywalking, and then their faces are stuck up on big billboards and those sorts of things, or social media credits that you earn, and then you have these social media credits through the same sort of financial apps on your phone, so that you go up or down, so you go down, you can't start to do things like send your kids to certain schools or even ride in certain carriages on a train, something like that.
But in the New Zealand context, it may look like what Phil Pennington on Radio New Zealand had identified with the New Zealand police, that via stealth, and it was fairly high up the food chain from what I could observe, not way down the pecking order of the New Zealand police, that the facial recognition kicks in. No one's really aware of that the data has been collected in a significant way, and perhaps preempting a police response to certain groups of individuals based on how they have categorised their digital data, their digital identity.
So that's exactly why you have to start having the conversation now, because you think in New Zealand you can that sort of thing doesn't going to happen because we're not that kind of population, right? We don't have that kind of political system which enables that kind of thing.
But now, those in the Urewera raids, for example, might say, well, hang on a minute, there's a more invasive government in the certain conditions, irrespective of,
and that's going back a decade. And what you're talking about with I think it was the one that Phil Pennington brought up in Radio New Zealand, it wasn't as if the police came out with this idea that they're going to start doing this. It was an experimental, wherever it sat in the chain of command, but it wasn't as if they'd really thought through all the consequences. And since doing that, I'm not defending what they did, but since doing it,
you're coming from a tech point of view.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is that you see a new tool, bright, shiny thing, and you go, ooh, what does this do? And you forget that you're sitting in police, but where does that end and where does that start? And that's the problem with technology. It becomes really ubiquitous. And the reason that I highlight something like Internet of Behaviours, because it's a very, very new concept. And it's been put in a commercial context, but they are also pointing towards the government, is because I think about the way New Zealand behaved in March and April. It was quite stunning in my lifetime to be told to stay home and not leave my suburb. And I did it, and most of us did it. That is a huge social thing to impose on a population for something that none of us had personal experience of, which was this virus. But we all got it and we all did it. And that was a really interesting example of social obedience, which, if you had a technical solution that could bring in the outliers under the cause of that, what would that look like? And something like the Internet of Behaviours is where you could start to see that happening if you're in the kind of 1984, that kind of frame of mind. Now, most of us go, that wouldn't happen in New Zealand, but you've just pointed out something that happened about 15 years ago, in that circumstance. And we see things happening with the police. It's just really important to start having those discussions now, which is what Gartner's trying to say, and what people on the edge of these things who read about this stuff all the time are trying to say. We need to start talking about the ethical and societal implications of this kind of information, because it's not just Google and Facebook in America trying to flog me.
It's broader than that.
It's about social control. And I just think that we've seen examples of this year. Look, I personally, I think most New Zealanders would say, we did the right thing. We should have stayed in our suburbs.
We were team players. I won't use we were team players as a society. We like team sports. We like all of those kind of things.
And because we were spoken to as adults primarily and we were given scientific, people were put in front of us and we got it and understood it. And I think we're all very, very pleased that we did, because we're not seeing what's happening in places like the US and the UK. It's not happening to us. But it's still a really interesting example of social behaviour that we've never seen before in this country, or I've not seen in my lifetime. Presume you could say in the war, sending those young men off to their deaths was another example, but that was 50 years ago. That wasn't my generation. That wasn't my lifetime.
So my takeaway points from this, Sarah, is one of the Internet of Behaviours, of people keeping an eye out for that kind of thing.
Yes.
Look it up, define it, have it sit and digest in your own kind of mind. And is it a force for good, Is it a force for bad, or is it somewhere in the middle? And obviously, you can't categorise these things just in one or the other. So diligence, Internet of Behaviours, that's the takeaway point. Yep.
And can I also just say, it's really, you don't want to go down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, right? You don't want to be sounding like everything's coming at you, and you don't want to give credence to that kind of stuff which proliferates and which is harmful. But and this is where you've got to tread that line, and you've got to go to science, and you've got to go to facts and data, and you've got to go to recognizable and credible sources. And I would really recommend that, because I'd hate for people to be watching and listening to our conversation now and thinking, oh,
yeah, it's all bad. Yeah, there's obviously great ways of communicating to a population, for a desired outcome, as opposed to controlling, and that kind of thing. I can see the merits of it. Look, let's keep debating it. That's what it's all about, isn't it? To discuss these things, keep debating it, not falling into the trap, as you say, on either side, of being naive or overly sensitive to the advancements of technology change. Fascinating times, though, isn't it? I can remember watching these kind of discussions on television 20 years ago and thinking, wow, that future, the year 2000, whatever the program was, be a pretty amazing time. It never stops to advance, never stops to challenge. On those points, Sarah, never does. Thank you for joining us again. We'll be back in about 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about that social dilemma, aren't we? So thanks, Sarah. We'll see you later. To those who have joined us, thank you very much. And if you're watching it live, very much appreciated that. And if you're on video on demand later on, do join us live in about 2 weeks from now. And I look forward to your company then. Take care. Goodbye.